Today, the world faces a growing ecological and cultural crisis. Digitally driven automation is displacing workers in some countries ranging from 25 to 50%. We face other negative effects of economic globalization, such as the destruction of habitats, natural resources, and the traditions of cultural self-sufficiency. These issues didn't happen overnight. They've been centuries in the making. On a global scale, we also face the most devastating ecological crisis in human history. We're dealing with droughts, water shortages, problems of waste disposal, and food insecurity. Meanwhile, corporations are undermining local traditions, including the exercise of local democracy. Western technologies and the media are also promoting a consumer-dependent lifestyle that is ecologically unsustainable. One of the ways that educators can help address this cultural and environmental crisis can be found in the revitalization of the cultural commons.
So let me give you a definition of the cultural commons. The cultural commons involve all those forms of knowledge that are intergenerationally passed along face to face. And this is important to emphasize face to face because it says in effect that most of that knowledge passed on through digital technologies is not face to face and is highly abstract. And it's a recognition that in those face to face relationships, you have depth of knowledge, of character formation, of mutual support, of self-discovery, of who you are, and so on.
The purpose of this documentary is to show the range of cultural commons activities that exist in every community, and the role that education needs to play in teaching this to young people and adults today. The cultural commons includes the intergenerational knowledge and practices in every community that are often taken for granted. They represent the alternatives to being dependent upon the system of production and consumption. By participating in the gift economy of the cultural commons, people can reduce their dependency upon the money economy and environmentally destructive toxins. This documentary serves to help break the silence. Classroom teachers, community members, and professors will start the conversation, introducing students to the ecological importance of revitalizing the cultural commons. The cultural commons represent the largely non-monetized, non-commodified knowledge, skills, activities, and relationships that exist in every community. They are part of the intergenerational legacy within communities that enable people to engage in activities and enjoy relationships that are outside the mainstream consumer, money-dependent culture. The commons have sustained humanity for thousands of years. They began with the first humans and are comprised of both the natural and the cultural commons. The natural commons are the air we breathe, the water we use, plants, animals, and all other forms of naturally occurring resources that have historically been shared among all humans.
The word the commons really comes to us from English history, and the other word that is, I never talk about community anymore. I talk about the commons because the commons automatically have an opposing force, and that is enclosure. And that comes from English history. The beginning of the Industrial Revolution and the enclosure of the physical commons. But actually, the cultural commons began with the first groups wandering the savannas of what we call Africa. They passed on the knowledge of healing, of how to prepare people in terms of food, various activities, how to deal with death, how to deal with birth. All of these activities represented forms of knowledge that were passed on before we got to the point of a money economy.
When resources that were once free become privatized, we call that enclosure. What was once part of the natural commons is rapidly becoming privatized and monetized.
So we see the idea of enclosure as meaning the lack of commons. It's the opposite of the commons. It's restricting access. It's when the free market society has made things that we assume belong to everybody all of a sudden a commodity that belongs to individuals. And only individuals have rights to that. The access is limited, it's cut off. It makes everything something that's available for purchase. And it doesn't make for community and commons. It makes for individual ownership. And it makes some people more powerful and have control over other people.
I was expecting manufacturing, a line of people working, making cars and stuff like that. And it's nothing like that. There are machines that make cars. Like after every 10 or 12 stations, and there's one person monitoring this 10 robots. And it's not, in my head, I was thinking when somebody mentioned there are robots making cars, I was thinking of a human form of robots. These are just machine parts.
What's astonishing is that on April 15th, 1998, the first privatization in the whole United States happened here in San Antonio, Texas. This deal cost San Antonio $30 million. And what the deal was between a DBO, it took in the form of design, build, and operate, where the Bear Metro policies, along with the United Water Services, combined together and joined as a partnership in forming for this regulation on the privatization of water.
The world of work is increasingly being automated, rationalized, controlled from the top. And so it's very important for the mediator to help students clarify what is the difference between their sense of identity, their sense of meaning, their relationships, what skills, what crafts, what dependency or independence emerges. Because in the consumer world, you lose skill, relationships, mutual support systems, but you increase dependence on a money economy, which is disappearing.
The cultural commons include the knowledge and supportive relationships shared from generation to generation that exist in every community. They may be shared between social groups as well as being rooted in distinct cultural traditions.
What students learn from their experience in observing and recounting the various forms of cultural commons activity is that we need to move toward the exercise of ecological intelligence, and thus to recognize how everything is interdependent with everything else, and that it isn't a matter of consuming or the matter of having an individual career, but participating in supportive activities.
I'm actually looking at the San Antonio Storytelling Association, how the art of storytelling has been lost over generations. And so with this project, which will be related to the Academy, I'll be able to go and actually partake in a storytelling session with these folks and actually have a chance to write a paper and talk about how we need to reintroduce this art that has long been forgotten.
And the cultural commons are about relationships. And so it's learning to see how we fit and develop our own interests and talents and sense of mutual support in these relationships.
These cultural commons include the creative arts, craft knowledge, the cultivation and sharing of food, bartering, non-monetized systems of exchange, oral history, healing and medicinal practices, music, song, ceremonies, games, and languaging systems that range from oral to written forms. Patterns of mutual support and traditions for settling disputes and civil liberties are also examples of the cultural commons.
Every ethnic group has its own traditions of the cultural commons around food, healing, narratives, ceremonies, dance, and so on. Okay, so it's culturally diverse. And so we're looking then at the diversity of the world's cultural commons.
Of course, not all the cultural commons should be preserved. For example, the Ku Klux Klan was part of the cultural commons of many communities. Violent youth gangs and others that support racist or sexist practices are also examples of the cultural commons that should not be carried forward. The cultural commons that should be carried forward are those that support positive relationships and more sound ecological practices. Most people are unaware of how much they rely on intergenerational knowledge and the skills and practices of the cultural commons. Because they do not realize these gifts, they fail to resist the loss of important traditions that are part of their cultural commons. The cultural commons activities carried forward in every community tend to be local and less reliant on fossil fuels and other toxic chemicals. They often bring people together in a performing task governed by cooperation rather than competition.
What are the activities that would be included in the cultural commons? Well, it would be, and these vary from culture to culture, it would be the growing and preparation and sharing of food. The recipes are passed on intergenerationally. And the kinds of conversation that go on around these meals, and profoundly different from going to McDonald's or to industrial forms of food processing and sharing. So a key part of this is that it's intergenerational, face-to-face knowledge and relationships. Secondly, the range includes, as I mentioned, food, healing practices, ceremonies, narratives, the creative arts, craft knowledge, games, language itself, civil liberties. You don't have to buy civil liberties, it's passed on, it's institutionalized, okay? It's an intergenerational form of knowledge and wisdom, okay? So just about everything we do, if we were to look at it from an ethnographic point of view, we could see that there are so many things that do not require consumerism. We don't have to put a monetary value on it.
Once I made a few connections, it just seemed to all come together because the farmers and the ranchers are kind of a close-knit family. And so they know each other and they trust each other. So once I got in, I was in. And now I have a great relationship with them. And we do things like we get together as chefs or cooks and we cook together. So we might get together where there's 15 chefs and spend a weekend at somebody's ranch. And we're cooking and we're sharing. Wow. Right. So, and those are beautiful. Or one of the chefs will have a dinner, and it's all local, organic ingredients, and we'll go out to that. So I think the community is really passionate about their food.
Participating in cultural commons activities, whether in the creative arts or preparing a shared meal, involves being more fully present in the moment. Forms of enclosure threaten the cultural commons. Unfortunately, in most communities around the world, intergenerational knowledge and skills are being undermined by forces of technological and economic globalization. These create new forms of dependencies, poverty, and environmental devastation. Every area of the cultural commons is now under pressure, driven by the ideology of market liberalism and technologies. Other forms of enclosure result from the increased reliance upon digitized knowledge and abstract patterns of communication. The fast pace of everyday life contributes to isolating people from learning from one another. The language used in the media and our educational institutions promotes the modern mindset that equates change with progress.
What we view as progress in America, as far as with our economy and with the advancements in technology, are really contributing to unemployment in America and throughout the country, and significantly affecting various aspects of the cultural commons. And that was something that I hadn't really considered before or thought of, and I'm glad that I'm now aware of that and I can possibly help with that problem in my profession, education.
What about the role of the classroom teacher and the professor? I think you could make a case that in terms of public school education, students should be introduced to what is the richness and complexity of the local cultural commons that's carried forward. Who are the mentors? What are the various activities that people are engaged in that are less dependent upon consumerism, that have a smaller toxic footprint? Then the question becomes, can the teacher help the student look at the relationship between a consumer relationship and a cultural commons relationship? And I call this role that of a mediator, where the teacher is not dictating that this is better than this, but rather calling upon the student to reflect on the differences in their experiences when they're engaged in a cultural commons activity. Maybe it's in a local play, maybe it's in some athletic activity, maybe it's in weaving, maybe it's around food issues. What is the difference between that, a meal shared within the family, and going to McDonald's? The difference between learning to become a performer in some area and buying other people's performance, which is hyped by corporate values.
One of the ways that universities and schools might address the need to revitalize the cultural commons is to host seminars that link the cultural commons to schooling. In 2012, the University of Texas San Antonio hosted a 5-day academy for the critical inquiry of the cultural commons. In the seminar, local activists, students, faculty, ordinary citizens met to discuss, to share their experiences of enclosure and their gifts of the cultural commons. Films, speakers, demonstrations, and lectures were featured, and a bridge between the academy and the local knowledge of the cultural commons was forged.
What is unique about the academy is that it provided an extended period of time to hear the many voices and to examine the explanations of relationships and patterns that usually put the cultural commons out of focus. Usually in the academic world, presentations are made within a 15-minute time frame, or perhaps a day may be devoted. But in this case, we had a full week to both think about the conceptual roots that are diverting attention from the real possibilities that already exist in the local communities. And in that sense, the Academy provided a very unique and I think revolutionary step forward.
We need a much larger curriculum. We need a curriculum project that teaches people from the very earliest times exactly where we are headed. Not in an alarmist fashion, not so much so that little children would not be able to sleep at night, but at least in such a way that they can look out for signs in the future. They can know what's coming. They can know how to prepare themselves. And to be honest with you, they can seek a way of life as well as a means of making a living that does not contribute to the greater demise of our civilization. I think we have to find new ways to live lightly on the land. I think we have to, most importantly, find new ways to educate the next generation.
Understanding the complex, interdependent nature of the cultural commons is the way forward.